Welcome to The Insider, the official podcast for the City of Murfreesboro. I'm Mike Browning. Our topic for this podcast, the National Flood Insurance Program with project engineer Jennifer Knauf, who serves as the city's Floodplain Administrator. The National Flood Insurance Program was established in 1968 to protect U.S. residents against the financial hardship of flooding, with the goal of doubling the number of properties covered by flood insurance and quadruple the amount invested in mitigation. Knauf joined the city in October 2022 and served as an engineer for the Metro Water Resources or Services Department in Nashville, coordinating stormwater management before coming to Murfreesboro. Jennifer, thanks a lot for being with us on The Insider.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So everything flooding and flood management is what you're all about.
Yes, I have spent 20 years at Metro Water Services in their stormwater development and development services, and being part of their floodplain management, stormwater management.
So we're fortunate to have you here in Murfreesboro to do the same thing here and to help manage flooding. We have the Stones River, of course, and Murfreesboro recently adopted new flood maps. That was effective May 9th of 2023. Can you explain how these maps get revised or changed and then they get adopted, I guess, too?
Yeah, sure. We went through what's called a physical map revision that's usually initiated by FEMA. FEMA will identify communities in need of updating their maps to, update floodplain boundaries, flood elevations, base flood elevations, and regulatory floodways. With our last map update of 2007, we were in need of an update. So FEMA came in and did a restudy of the Stones River watershed, and that included all the jurisdictions in Rutherford County, including Laverne, Smyrna, and Eagleville. So in February 2020, we received our preliminary flood maps and updated flood insurance study, and that initiated a 90-day appeal period and public comment. And then in November of last year, we received our letter of final determination to adopt the new flood maps by May 9th of 2023.
So an obvious question that the audience would probably ask right away is, why do these things even change to begin with? What makes it required that they change? And I guess the question would be, is it possible that you're not in the plane or you're not in the area and then all of a sudden you are?
In an ideal world, we would be updating our flood maps every 5 to 7 years, because it takes an average of 5 to 7 years to go from initiation to a final adoption of the flood maps. It's a very long and timely process.
What is actually changing in the environment or with the government, I guess, that would require it to change?
There are multiple factors that could cause the flood maps to change, and it's not just due to one factor alone. You could have a historic flood event or changes in the landscape due to development. But one of the main reasons maps change is due to advances in technology. With flood maps from 2007, you're going to have flood models that date back to the 80s and 90s, so they really need to be updated with the technology that we have today.
What about the whole aspect of new development? Does new development change it at all?
It could, but with Murfreesboro growing so rapidly, our landscape has changed significantly in the last 20 years. But I would say that advances in technology, think about how our computers and televisions and mobile devices have advanced over the last decades or so. we didn't even have widely used internet back in the 90s. So if we have maps as old as 2007, that means we have outdated flood models from the 80s and 90s. Now we have ortho aerial photography, LiDAR, digital elevation models, GIS, and advanced software programs that give us better data that we did not have in the past. Updating a model with better data will change a flood map either by increasing or decreasing flood elevations and increasing or decreasing floodway widths.
So I think I have a better understanding of it now. It'd be similar to like weather forecasting. So now over the years with technology, we can predict in a better way weather, although it's not perfect, and we have a better way of forecasting or knowing when tornadoes or severe weather can come into the area. So with that said, FEMA and these experts, these scientists that study this, then determine where these flood hazard areas or flood plains are based on all this technology. What are those? What are those areas? And maybe kind of explain to us what they are.
Yeah, so I'll explain how flood maps are created. So FEMA studies and maps 3 primary categories of flood risks, and those are riverine, coastal, and shallow. Of course, in our area, our flood maps are predominantly based on riverine flooding. A flood study is performed to determine the flow rate of water and the depth of base flood on the configuration and roughness of the river or stream channel and the adjacent area that carries that water. When that study is complete, the information and maps are assembled in what's called a flood insurance study, or FIS. This report contains the detailed flood elevation data in flood profiles and data tables that are used to create the maps.
So with that flood insurance study, is that what you have right before you?
Yeah, so this is what it looks like. It's a comprehensive study that describes how the flood maps are determined and created, what data is used to determine the flood elevations and the width of the regulatory floodways.
So you have this big study that's fairly thick. Most likely, the average homeowner probably isn't going to reference that, although you would probably prefer that they look on the FEMA website and look for that information. How would a normal homeowner start? Let's say they live on the Stones River, and maybe they just bought a house there, so they're not familiar with what it's like to live that close to a waterway. What would be the best approach for them to look into this for themselves?
So if they want to see if their property is located in a special flood hazard area, there are several sources they can go to. The FEMA Map Service Center is the official source for the flood insurance rate maps and flood insurance study. It has all the effective maps as well as historical old maps and letter of map revisions.
And if you were doing this for the first time, what advice would you give? What would be the first thing you would want to look for?
The first thing they would need to look for is whether or not their property is inside a special flood hazard area, or if they're even close to if they're even close to a special flood hazard area. Like, are they close to a flooding source? If they are inside a special flood hazard area, then most likely they'll be required to buy flood insurance from their mortgage lender.
And you said the FEMA Map Service Center is the place they go to start that?
They can go there, or they can go to FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer. It is a GIS-based website. And of course, they can always contact me at the planning department, or they can come see me or give me a call. I
guess the other thing, in addition to FEMA, the Murfreesboro website has a GIS map, and it's not necessarily the official source, but but people can use that as a resource.
Yes, we've integrated our GIS website to show the latest and effective FEMA floodplain information.
And is that interactive, or what would someone do if they went on that site to find their location and everything?
All they have to do is type in their address. It'll pull it up on GIS and turn on the flood hazard layers in the program, and yeah, it'll show whether or not they're in the floodplain.
And what is floodsmart.gov?
Floodsmart.gov is the official National Flood Insurance Program website, or NFIP. It contains everything anyone needs to know about flood insurance.
So navigating all these websites, we've mentioned several of them, and we've kind of talked a little bit about what's the first thing you would do. But is there some advice you might give, since you're the floodplain administrator, on how someone would navigate these sites and navigate the process to make it, I guess, simpler?
Well, actually, we are in the process of creating our own webpage dedicated to floodplain management, and we're going to include all the links that will be helpful for them, so they can go just to one place and click on links to obtain maps or information concerning flood insurance.
So the city has a site now for the floodplain management, but you're going to be improving upon it.
Yeah, it's currently under construction, but we're looking to have a page dedicated solely to floodplain management, and it's for the general public to use, as well as project engineers, developers, real estate agents, anyone who needs any information concerning floodplain management.
One thing most of us have heard about, even someone who doesn't live near a floodplain or a waterway, you hear a lot about during flooding periods about this idea of a 100-year flood, or maybe even, a 1,000-year flood, and then there's this concept of Zone A and Zone AE, which I don't know what that is, but can you explain that terminology and why it's important for people to understand?
Yes, so flood zones are marked as with a Zone A or AE, in particular in Murfreesboro. So Zone A floodplains are kind of like, they're shown like a blob on the map. They're identified as a flood zone, but there's not a determined flood elevation with that, because there hasn't been a detailed study along that stream or flooding source. Zone AE are detailed studies that establish base flood elevations. So if you're in a Zone AE, that means there is a known base flood elevation in probably a regulatory floodway.
Okay, and then the idea of a 100-year flood, what does that really mean?
Some people think of it as a flood that occurs every 100 years, but that's not the case. It's actually the correct term, or the correct definition is that it is the 1% chance of that flood equal or exceeding in any given year.
Yeah, and a 1% chance seems pretty small, but we know, having lived for very long and having watched what happened in Nashville, that these flood events do occur.
I frequently hear, like, my property I've lived here 18 years and I've never flooded. But what you need to understand is that the flood event that we regulate to is the 1% annual chance flood. If we were to get hit with a historical flood event, it's going to be greater than a 100-year flood. It could be a 500-year, 1,000-year flood event, like the May 2010 flood.
That was a 1,000-year event.
Yeah.
And we just happened to experience it here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think we talked about this a little bit, but what is considered a special flood hazard area, or I guess it's an SFHA?
A special flood hazard area is any area on a FERM map that is subject to the base flood or the regulatory floodplain. The base flood is the flood having a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year.
And what does that mean to the homeowner that lives there?
If their home is in a special flood hazard area, then most likely they'll be required to carry flood insurance from their lender.
And the reason they're required is because the government requires it.
Areas in the special flood hazard area have at least a 1 in 4 chance of flooding in a 30-year mortgage. So those people who are inside the special flood hazard area, that's why they're most likely required to carry flood insurance.
So in a way, it's kind of protecting the provider of the loan that's providing funding for this home, and then it's a little extra because there's a difference between homeowners insurance and then flood or earthquake hazard insurance, right? What's the difference? Why do you have to have both, I guess, if you're going to be in that hazard area or if you're fearful of a disaster?
Homeowners and renters insurance generally don't cover flooding or natural disasters, but flood insurance is a separate policy that can cover buildings and contents in a building or both. A flood insurance policy reimburses you up to $250,000 for your home or $500,000 for a business. And claims are paid without a disaster declaration, and no payback is required. And flood insurance is available for everyone that lives in the community that participates in the NFIP. So you do not have to live in a special flood hazard area to buy or purchase flood insurance. It's available to anyone, and that's because flooding can happen anywhere, not just in floodplains.
And why is that? What happens when flooding occurs away from an area that might be a stream?
Damages from flooding can occur not only from floodwaters, but anything that is not properly anchored down, like storage sheds, trailers, cars. Floodwaters will pick these items up and carry them and debris downstream, and they can hit other buildings, utility poles. They can clog pipes and bridges and just cause further destruction and flooding.
The other thing that, in addition to the flood hazard area, there's the idea of a floodway. What's the difference between those two, the flood hazard area and the floodway?
So the floodway is the stream channel itself plus the adjacent floodplain that is required to be preserved in order to carry floodwaters without causing an increase of a foot or more in flood elevations. So think of a floodway as being a width, and a floodplain is an actual elevation.
So the floodplain, would that be wider then or extensive, and then the flood way is more of like the narrow stream area that we see the water in?
Yeah, so the floodway, it includes the stream channel itself and the adjacent floodplain. So the floodway is the area that needs to be preserved and protected to be able to carry floodwaters. And so the floodplain can extend beyond the floodway.
Okay, good. That's helpful to understand. And we talked about why property owners are required to have flood insurance, but what we haven't discussed is maybe to clear up some misunderstanding. Sometimes when floods occur, the government steps in and they help provide some support or some help to the homeowners. That's different than insurance because that is really in the form of a grant, which is different because you have to pay it back.
So you're talking about disaster assistance, and that only comes about usually during a presidential declaration. So it's not always available on every flood event. And a disaster disaster assistance is not going to help you rebuild. It's only just going to get you on your feet to, you know, try to get you back on your feet to rebuild or repair your structures.
Not the full cost of the
Right.
full replacement. And even if it did, the grants are really designed to give you a loan so that you pay it back.
That's right. And flood insurance is not the case. It is, you know, you get better claims with your flood insurance.
So that behooves the person, if they live in an area near a waterway and they want to really protect themselves, they really need some kind of insurance.
Right.
To make sure that they're fully covered. Why should you buy flood insurance or homeowners insurance? And get back to that question of people who say, well, it's never flooded in my area. I've lived here maybe even 50 years and it's never had. Why should they still do it, especially if they're in these areas?
40% of insurance claims occur outside of special flood hazard areas. Also, more and more homes are being built in the floodplain. Developers are coming in and putting fill in the floodplain to lift the homes and get those homes, you know, removed from the floodplain through a letter of map revision. But homeowners need to educate themselves and make sure they need to get with their lender to make sure that flood insurance could still be required. Their mortgage lenders, it's still their prerogative to require flood insurance because a letter of map revision is not going to physically remove that structure out of the floodplain.
You mentioned something that caught my interest when you were talking about home builders or developers building in certain areas. The city has some regulations on that, right? Like there's some places where you literally cannot build and some places where you get some kind of an exemption or change. Explain that process for us.
Our floodplain regulations are located in Section 34 of the zoning ordinance, and in there you will find what our restrictions are for developing in the floodplain and floodways. Development in the floodplain can occur with certain restrictions, such as we have freeboard requirements. Residential and non-residential buildings need to be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And development in the floodways is prohibited without either you have to submit a no-rise certification or obtain a conditional letter of map revision.
So this is good to know that when development is made, that there is a process that developers are required to go through in order to get through the process of zoning or whatever it is that they need to do in order to make a development. What about your future plans? What are your plans for the floodplain management going forward?
Yes, so we are currently going through an audit with FEMA, and that is technically called a community assistance visit, or CAV. And every community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program will typically go through an audit with FEMA every 5 years or so. It's very normal. When that occurs, FEMA will come in and audit our program to make sure that we are enforcing our regulations like we're required to do. And they'll just analyze the effectiveness of our program. They'll review our permits and permitting processes and elevation certificates, and they'll actually do a tour of the floodplains in our city. So we just completed our CAV with FEMA, and they have given us a list of corrective items to complete, and one of the things is community outreach, and our website. We're working on our website to dedicate to floodplain management, as well as training our staff, because we have a lot of new people over the last 5 or 10 years who need additional training on when they review their permits and plans.
So this is part of community outreach right here, because one of the goals is it's a complicated process, it's complex, and you want the public, first of all, to be aware of it, and then to be able to understand it better.
Yes, I want people to have a better understanding of what the National Flood Insurance Program is and what these flood maps mean, and so that they can make better informed decisions when they're looking to buy properties in the floodplain, or whether or not they need to buy flood insurance.
In preparation for this podcast, you mentioned something called the community rating system. So for someone who is aspiring to really go a step further, a community could develop a process where they make it even more rigorous, and it can have benefits in terms of discounting insurance.
Currently, we participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and there are 402 communities in Tennessee that participate, and that means everyone who lives in the community is able to buy flood insurance. But then there's a program called the Community Rating System. It's like a higher standard where if we participated, that gives a discount on insurance to our residents in our community. So it would be like we are on a junior pro league where everyone can sign up and play on the team. Everybody can participate, and we get a participation trophy. But in the community rating system, it's more like the elite athletes that play on the advanced team.
So only a few communities are.
There are only 12 communities in Tennessee that participate in the community rating system, and that would mean they adopt higher standards that go above and beyond the minimum NFIP requirements or the state requirements.
Well, again, that's something to aspire toward, I guess. Jennifer, thanks for being our guest on The Insider.
Thank you, Mike, for having me.
Jennifer Knauf has been our guest for this edition of The Insider. We've been highlighting floodplain mapping and flood insurance, originating the podcast from City Hall. Thanks for listening to The Insider via Podbean, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music Audible. For additional information on the city's floodplain program, visit the city's website. To determine if a property is in the floodplain, interested persons may contact the planning department at 615-893-6441 or visit the City GIS website and webpage. Or you can go to www.fema.gov, the official site. For more information on the fast-growing city of Murfreesboro, visit murfreesborotn.gov. Insider is the official podcast for the city of Murfreesboro. I'm Mike Browning. Thanks for joining us.